I'm not even going to bother. Let's just get into it. You know I'm late. I know I'm late. Stuff's been happening. Let's just go. Hey guys, what's up? So, this one I've been wanting to put up for a while, and it actually kind of morphed into the topic that I wanted to touch on now. You guys may know, because I've mentioned it in past videos, that I have a pet hypothesis about older Chinese swords and how they evolved over time with the styles that were being used from it. And by the way, I say hypothesis, not theory, because a theory has a lot more backing it up. Scientific literacy is important. But my little pet hypothesis is basically this. I believe that the Jian, or the Chinese straight sword, and the Dao back in the Han Dynasty were more or less being used similarly. Because if you look at the way they look and how they came about during the time period, it kind of makes sense to me that whatever swordsmanship, whatever art that was being used, it wouldn't make too much sense to try to come up with a style that was drastically different. I'll get into this in a bit, but I'm sure you guys know what I'm talking about. And I wanted to touch on that further today, but as I was doing a little bit of research and preparing this particular video, something else occurred to me. In that I think there was a lot of back and forth going on between the development of the fighting arts with these weapons and how the weapons would end up being designed over time. And some interesting cross-pollination ended up happening because of it. You'll see where I'm going with this. I'm hoping this doesn't get to be too rambly, but it's something that occurred to me as I was getting this video prepared. So let's go with what I said in the beginning, that I think in the beginning, the Chinese straight sword and, known as the Jian, and the Chinese saber, or what we now know as the Dou, were probably used very similarly. So what do I mean by that? Well, remember, in the beginning, as far as military use is concerned, you had what's known as a Han Jian, or a Han Dynasty Jian. Now, this particular piece that I'm holding here is one of the models from LK-Chen. And in fact, I might as well just simply say that a lot of the swords I'm going to be showing today are from LK-Chen, but it helps to use theirs because they pretty much make historical replicas. So it's really helpful for what I'm trying to show with this particular video right now. So I wanted to pick this one instead of the Flying Phoenix because I think that the profile for this one is a lot more representative of what you would see with a Jian from the Han Dynasty. So if you look at this particular piece here, it has what they would call an 8-sided geometry, in that you got like that double bevel thing going on here. So you got the bevel for the edge, and then you got the change in angle going to the spine of the blade. Now notice that while it has just enough heft and mass for a decent cut, it is more or less a narrow blade designed for thrusting. And this really makes me think, especially with how long this particular blade is, which from what we've seen of antique pieces is kind of a typical length for these. These were made for long distance fighting and for thrusting, and they were paired with shields, which kind of goes along with, the small handguard, because you don't want the handguard bumping up against the shield when you're fighting. So yeah, a lot of thrusts are going to be used with a weapon like this. And in fact, even though we don't have any surviving manuals or treatises on what the fighting arts were like with these weapons during military use, and, as you can guess, like, we don't have any surviving Han Dynasty swordsmanship styles, but we do have some written accounts of thrusts being some of the main methods used with these swords. Now, toward the end of the Han Dynasty, you end up with the Dao, which would end up supplanting, the Jian as a military weapon. It would still end up being a civilian's weapon, but, and we will get into the brief period where it became a military weapon again, but it was a very brief period. But for all intents and purposes, from this point on, from the end of the Han Dynasty onwards, the Dao became the main military sidearm. When they moved over to the Dao, we end up with what's typically this. And right away, you can see it's long, just like the Jian that was made at that time. You also end up with a blade that, as far as, the profile here is going, it's still kind of narrow. The difference being that this is a single-edged sword. You got a thicker spine, so that's really going to help with, cutting actions, with, chopping, striking blows. That extra mass on that back blade, on, the back part of the blade, it's really going to help. The mass is really going to help. Like, adding that extra weight is going to put a lot more oomph, a lot more impact on the cut. But it is still pretty much straight. There is a slight inverse curve, very slight in this particular case, but for the most part, you can still thrust with this. Like, whatever style you were using with the Jian, it's still going to be used pretty effectively with this. It's just that now you got the benefit of that added mass by having that thick spine there to really, hit, a target and really be effective with that particular type of blow. Now, what's interesting is that for several dynasties afterwards, this is pretty much the shape that they're going to be sticking with for their military swords. They're all going to be fairly long, and they're all going to be kind of narrow, and you're more or less going to be able to thrust and cut effectively. So what that tells me is that they must have been using a similar fighting style for both these types of weapons, for both a Jian and a Dao, considering that more or less they're designed similarly, more or less. I mean, they're not exactly the same. One's a single-edged weapon, one's double-edged. One's going to have a much heavier cut. The other one's going to be a little bit easier to thrust with, but more or less it's the same thing. So you could use the same fighting techniques with it. Fast forward to the Tang Dynasty, and we'll see that not much has changed. Let's take this particular piece, which was one that was used during the Tang Dynasty. This particular blade, while it is a bit shorter than the ones that I've just shown, it's still fairly long. Like, it's a decent length, but it's straight. You got the point here, which, while it's not as smooth, like here, it's a lot more rigid. You don't have that kind of gradual curve to the tip there, like you see with the Han Dao. It's still more or less kind of like a similar profile. The major change with this is that the edge to the ridge there is now longer. Like, you got a lot more surface material from the edge to here, where before it was very, very brief. So what that basically tells me is that this particular one is going to facilitate cutting a lot more. It's going to be easier to cut through your target since you have a lot more surface area for the edge. But it's still more or less, a similar design for the Dao. And since it's still straight, whatever styles that you were using with the Jian could pretty much be used for this. It's just going to be easier to cut with. What's also interesting, though, is that if you look at Jian, and I don't think we really have any surviving Jian from the Tang Dynasty. We usually see some Jian from the Song Dynasty onwards, but you'll notice that we no longer see the so-called 8-sided blade geometry. Now it's more the so-called 4-sided, or the kind of diamond geometrical pattern that we tend to see with those swords, which tells me that it made it easier to cut with those. Not saying that the 8-sided ones can't cut. Of course they can, and we've seen that plenty of times before, but it is easier to cut with something with an edge like this than with the so-called 8-sided variety, where you have a lot more surface area leading to, the ridge, the center ridge, or should I say, the ridge part of the blade profile here. So yeah, this, I got, still extra space here, so you can have more leverage in a two-handed cut, but you can still fight with this thing one-handed. And yeah, if you are mostly a Jian user and you got this in your hands, you're still going to be able to use your techniques with this. So once again, that makes me think that whatever sword styles were being used at the time, they were probably being used more or less interchangeably with a lot of weapons like this. But once we reach around the Ming Dynasty, that's when things get interesting on the military side of things. Remember, I'm talking about the military weapons. I'm not really focusing on the civilian side of things, at least not yet. I'm still talking about how, as far as military use is concerned, we're seeing weapons made more or less similarly that could most likely use a fighting style interchangeably with these particular weapons. But then we reach the Ming Dynasty and things shift. Things change. So now we reach the Ming Dynasty, particularly the late Ming Dynasty, and we see an interesting type of saber or dao show up. And it's this one, the Yangling Dou, also known as the goose quill saber. What's interesting about this one is that we're starting to introduce a curve. Well, okay, I shouldn't say starting. Curved blades were already showing up in China, courtesy of, different militaries that the Chinese encountered from the west of their particular nation. However, you're starting to see that influence here. There's a very slight curve happening with this weapon. It's still mostly straight, okay? In fact, one of the things that you will hear about the Yanqing Dou, or the goose quill, is that people who are used to fighting with a Jian could easily use those techniques with this. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why this particular weapon, was favored by people who knew how to use the Jian a particular way. It's like, okay, I could just pick this up and use it similarly. But what that tells me, considering that this thing has a slight curve to it, that must have been something that was done before, right? I mean, if you got a weapon like this with a very slight curve, but because the weapon is just slightly curved, it's still, it's straight enough to be able to employ, more, mincing type of cuts and a lot of thrusting type techniques. If you're able to look at this and go, yeah, my Jian stuff will still work with this, what does that tell you about the straight dao that was used in the past? I don't think it's that much of a stretch to think that the styles must have been unified back then. But now that we're reaching a point where we're beginning to separate our one-handed weapons, into like, okay, now we got our single-edged weapons, we got our double-edged weapons, we got our curved single ones, and they use a particular way. Now, it's beginning to tell me that, okay, they must have been used in a very similar fashion as long as they were straight and able to thrust as well as cut. But now that we're starting to move more toward primary cutters, like things that are made mostly for cutting, that there must have been a separation of styles going on, but that there were still weapons that would be given to somebody who was used to using a certain type of weapon. So yeah, that's what I see with this. And I still see to this day people say that, oh yeah, this one's great for somebody who knows how to use both Dou and Jian, because now they can use them interchangeably. Not to mention that the weapon techniques that we now see as stereotypically for the Dou, particularly, the body wrapping type motions that you see with this, we see similar motions from martial systems to the west of China. There are similar motions that we see with fencing systems that was used in India. We're seeing some similar ones used by the Persians, like that same kind of body wrapping stuff. So, I'm not trying to say that, the Chinese couldn't have figured this out on their own, but it kind of tells me how the design of the weapon can shape how it's being used. And now that we got this primary cutter, they're differentiating with, the techniques that are used for it. But in the case of this particular one, which has a very slight edge, the fact that they're saying that they could use Jian techniques with it tells me that, oh, well, that mentality must have been used before, especially when the weapons were all straight at one point in time in China. Something else, though, that I want to draw attention to is how wide this blade is. Up until now, they had been, fairly narrow. The earlier ones were really narrow, and then as time goes on, they get a little bit wider, but not that much wider. The Tang Dou had a decent width to it, but it was still, narrow enough so that it could be used nimbly with one hand. This one, however, this one's much wider. Now thankfully, it still has a really good balance and weight to it so that you can easily use this nimbly with one hand, but the width of this is basically telling me that this is meant to cut, okay? It kind of reminds me of how when you look at certain long swords or certain arming swords, you can tell whether they're meant to be cutters and not by how wide the blade is. Well, that's kind of what I'm seeing with this. But you're probably watching this going, well, yeah, obviously. I mean, it's wide, and you know, the shape of it, it lends itself to cutting. What's your point? Well, my point is this. Recognize this one. This one is a Jian from the Ming Dynasty. And what some people may not know is that during the Ming Dynasty, there was a brief resurgence of Jian being used on the battlefield. So we had several dynasties now where the Dao was the main military sidearm, okay? And they were being used most likely a particular way. And now we're going to the Ming Dynasty where suddenly these are briefly enjoying periods of, time fighting on the battlefield, not just in civilian, conflicts. So now that we've brought this back, are there any changes to this? Well, besides the furnishings, not really all that much, right? Except, you notice something different here. I noticed something right away. Look how wide this blade is. I mean, think about the sword the straight sword that I just showed you before. Think about that Hanjian that I showed you way back. It's narrower than this. This is a big boy. I mean, maybe it's not big in terms of length, but the width here, I mean, this, I see this, and I immediately know this thing can cut. I mean, granted, holding it, you can tell just by the heft. The balance is still pretty nimble, don't get me wrong. I mean, you can easily do, your more delicate type motions with it, your more precise motions, thrusts, stuff like that. It can easily do that, but this is a bit of a chunky boy. This will hack through targets. It cuts through very easily. And considering that they were using these in the battlefield now, you know what that's making me think? And this is where I can really say this is a pet hypothesis. I'm beginning to think that the people who are more used to Dao would take easier to a Jian like this than one that's more built like the one from the Han Dynasty. Because if you're using a weapon that you were probably cutting more with thrusting, like you're used to just getting those really good hacks and chops in, and then you're given something like this, well, while you would probably want to learn something that allows you to take advantage of that point, right, and the fact that it's straighter, if you needed to fall back to those cuts that you're used to, this can do it for you. And now this is where that cross-pollination is beginning to happen, where things are beginning to go in the other direction. Instead of starting out with the Jian and having your sword techniques derived from that weapon, migrating to the Dao, and then that basically being the way you're using the Dao for a while, later on when we're beginning to see the Dao differentiate into its own weapon, now suddenly the way you're using that is being transferred back to this during the period of time when this was meant to be used in the battlefield. It's kind of funny when you think about it. It's also pretty interesting. And I know that's something that you don't really hear being discussed much when people are talking about the development of the fighting styles with these weapons in Chinese martial arts. Usually it's just taken as a given that the styles that were used with these are distinct, that you use the Jian this way and you use the Dao that way, and they're distinct techniques, and that's it. They're separate. That is a prevailing view, but the funny thing is, when you look at the history of these fighting styles, you start to see that it's not nearly as clear cut. That particular idea that these techniques are supposed to be distinct and that you're not really supposed to cross one with the other is something that came about during the Republican era of China, when they were trying to standardize their art similar to what they saw was happening in Japan, when they standardized their particular fighting arts. In China, they wanted to be able to make certain things distinct so it could be easier for them to, judge people or grade people on how they were practicing their forms and their arts and all that type of stuff during competitions and stuff like that. As well as, when you're, training your students in the school, and you got to find a proper way to rate their styles and rate their techniques and rate their, prowess. having distinct requirements for different styles and different weapons would make more sense. But in actual practice of usage, when you're actually having to fight on the battlefield, things get a little bit muddier, don't they? And now, considering the way the weapons are designed, again, look at this. Let's go back to this one. And right away, I mean, again, I'm not saying this can't cut. It can. But between this and this, yeah, you can tell which one is going to be used to cut a lot more often. Again, Han Dynasty, and then many years later, centuries later, this one looks like it was being influenced by many, many years of having to use a wider dull, which leads me to believe that modern Chinese Jian fighting systems were influenced by Daofa, or Dao techniques. And that's my pet hypothesis in a nutshell. And I know some people looking at me cross-eyed right now. Let me explain. I do say this is a hypothesis, okay? I could be wrong, but just hear me out, okay? Hear me out. You have to remember that the fighting styles that we see, the Chinese martial arts that we practice today, we really can only realistically trace them back to the Ming Dynasty. I know that's blasphemy for a lot of people to hear. There's going to be people practicing arts. Oh, this art goes back way back. According to legend, maybe. Or maybe you might happen to be sharing a name with a style that was used back then, but a lot of these styles were lost. They're fighting systems that we just aren't going to be able to reclaim today. There's just no written record of them, what their techniques were, how they practiced, all that. And even certain styles that we claim came back from somebody who lived way in the past. Things like Xingyiquan, it's like they really can only be traced back to practice during the Ming Dynasty. Anything earlier than that, it's more hearsay. It's more like, they're claiming lineage to something way in the past, but we don't really have any real record of what those styles were like. It's just more stories like, oh yeah, this guy used this style, he was awesome with it. Or we claim to have found this manual that was written way back, but we can't prove one way or another if it's true or not. So, for all intents and purposes, and I'm pretty sure we'll find some outliers here or there, but for the most part, it's really the Ming Dynasty onwards that we can trace many fighting systems from China today. That includes the weapons. So when you consider that, and then you consider what I just said about how the weapons look and how they were designed, as well as using a little bit of common sense, it stands to reason that many of the styles that we're practicing now were influenced by whatever fighting trends were going on from that particular time period. And from what I can see with the design of Ming weapons, it looks as if the straight sword, which again was used briefly on the battlefield during that time period, those techniques were probably influenced by what they were already doing with the dull. So what was all that nonsense that I said for? Like, what's the point that I'm trying to make? Well, I guess the main point that I'm trying to say here is that looking at the design of the weapon, just looking at how it's shaped can tell you a lot about how it was meant to be used or how it was probably used. Not to mention that these things are not as homogeneous as we may think, or how it's been portrayed. I think we tend to forget that not everybody was fighting exactly the same, that everyone was using the same techniques, and that these particular techniques were super distinctive. They were distinctive in some ways, yes, but okay, let's just put it another way. There's more than one type of longsword, right? And thus there was more than one way to use them. It's also why we had different masters writing different treatises on how these particular longswords were meant to be used, and then how they should be made, how they should be weighted, how long they should be, and so on and so forth. Well, the same thing was happening with Chinese martial arts as well. there were different types of Dao, and there were different types of Jian. And depending on the preference of the person using them and the person who later on may have become renowned enough to be a master and make a style to be passed on to people, they're going to have their own distinct ways of using these things. And that's going to influence the design of the weapon, and it's going to go back and forth that way. It's just that nowadays, with the emphasis on preserving tradition as well as the, push during the Republican era of China to standardize Chinese martial arts, we ended up trying to group all these techniques into one big lump and then saying that, oh, this is what a Jian is, this is what a Dao is. And just like you can't really do that with Western weapons, because the more you look at it, the more you realize that it's a lot more complicated than that. Like, should I even dare bring up the rapier? It's the same thing with Chinese martial arts, where it's like the more we really start going through the weeds and looking at these weapons, that's when you start noticing all these little differences. Oh, this one's wider than that one. This Jian it seems to be heavier than that one. Oh, this one seems shorter than that one. That must have influenced the techniques, and it would be really interesting if there was a lot more scholarly emphasis on digging up how these weapons were used. I know there is a movement going on right now where there is a lot more, rigorous study and research going on in Chinese martial arts to, define these things a lot better. But it's still not, as well known enough as I'd like. There is still a lot of, for lack of a better term, there's still a lot of kind of legend stuff going on when it comes to the history of Chinese martial arts. There's still a certain orthodox belief that goes in how these styles were meant to be seen, how they're supposedly developed, what the weapons were like, and so on. And actually finding out the real history of it, I think, would yield some more interesting insights into these weapons. I think ultimately we may find out that a Jian like, say, this would be used somewhat differently than one like this. I mean, to me, it seems that just from the design alone, as well as the preference of the person using them, there's going to be a distinct difference in some ways. Like, I see somebody using a weapon like this probably employing two-handed techniques more, relying a lot more on long-range thrusts and longer-range strategies, and not really depending too much on a cut except for as a counterattack maybe. Whereas this particular one, which is, the more contemporary Jian that we're using these days, this is going to be used primarily as a cut and thrust weapon. This is, you could use two hands if you want, but it's really meant more for one. You're going to be employing a lot of more agile footwork. Well, you need good footwork with both, but you're going to be using cuts and thrusts equally with this. You're going to be able to, change up on the fly and so on. Like, you're just going to try to adapt to what you're dealing with the opponent. That's the sense that I get. And considering that this is the later weapon and this was being used during the time when they were trying to standardize arts, I would not be surprised if, the way these were being used, especially the way we see it today, you see a lot more employment of different cut and thrust technique instead of whatever, style was used for this. Anyway, I'm hoping what I said made sense. I'm worried that I may have gotten lost in the weeds a bit here as I kept describing this, but ultimately the point I'm trying to make is the design of the weapon kind of hints at how it was used, and the development of arts over time ended up influencing the weapon, which ended up influencing the style, and so on and so forth. And I'm thinking that we may find that the differences, the variations in these weapons, which we don't really focus too much on, especially with the Jian. I'm thinking the more we start looking at the different designs of these swords, the more we may find some interesting insights in the techniques that were probably used for them. That was a whole lot of time just to say something that simple. But I still hope that you guys got something out of it. And I'll catch you guys later.